Alright, I'm back, guys, with Balance of World Order Part 2. So, in the last video, I covered a little bit of the current market deregulation via overturning the Chevron deference, but of course, not before segueing into the most recent collapse of our democracy, the removing of Roe. I do think it's far removed yet connected to reproductive politics. Of course, this regulation overturning plays into all facets of life, not just raising children. But in the long term, the future generations will pay the most. Also, the Supreme Court giving the president immunity, and it makes sense because our politicians and playing field is bought and paid for, meaning the president is a product and unregulated at the same time. Indeed, I am implying Chevron overturn and immunity are merged in some sense in the neoliberal schemes to control the president. All right. Lastly, I talked about the far right talking about immigration under Biden stealing 8 million jobs. Yet COVID era government overturning Roe, Title 42 enacted by Trump and continued by Biden, more rhetoric about elderly burdening society, while 80 million jobs are to be replaced by automation by 2025. The aging and shrinking nations are some of the reasons for automation rollout to the system. Every industrial checkpoint has caused people to adapt or fall through the cracks of the system, changing family structure. But this time, it's different with the magnitude of fertility decline, which isn't necessarily the fault of the citizens, but how our government and corporate bodies balance our autonomy and family flourishing. The automation rollout is not at all a fertility scheme, but elites potentially finding an alternative uh, as opposed to using populations and people. A warning to our freedom as we are likely to continue working to the bone. So I'm covering this interview talking about a book titled How All Politics Became Reproductive Politics, which goes into how feminists fought to raise children and tried for work, daycare, kind of merging, and maternal leave, etc. How reproductive politics is connected to the housing market, welfare stagnation, and the rise of Trump. Women doing both, raising children at work, was said to, quote, Sovietize our children as an excuse to make it more difficult for women to have families. Nowadays, people get a distorted view of feminism and dream of an anachronistic 1950s fantasy, although we are headed to 1984 dystopian type of world. The country is actually headed back hundreds of years as corporate deregulation is unleashed. So, as we see here, this is an interview. I thought I would start with the obvious questions. How are reproductive politics? Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's okay. How are politics reproductive politics? What I am trying to do in this book is to show how the economy and public policy lands in our households. Neoliberalism is a term used to refer to the radical shift in the U.S. economy over the last 40 years that has decreased real wages, thrown more and more people into the workforce, and reduced government supports for families like subsidized housing, elder daycare programs, and childcare. And so, do all these things add up in our daily lives? Mostly, it looks like stress. People are working longer hours with support to care for dependents. Our greedy jobs that are competing with the time we have to do household labor, what sociologists call the crisis of care labor. The neoliberal shift in the economy has radically transformed our reproductive lives, and the burden falls especially hard on women. How are employers contributing to the burdens on families? The high point of the value of minimum wage was 1968, and by the early 90s it was worth 40% less. So it was becoming less and less possible to support a household on minimum wage, and nobody knew that better than business did. There was a push to shame people for taking welfare, saying it was creating a cycle of dependency. In the debate over welfare, though, by dependents, in quotes, people didn't mean elders, children, people with disabilities, they mean the woman who cared for them. In the welfare reform debate, there was this big push to get caregivers into the labor force and minimum wage jobs at places in like the fast food industry or Walmart, employers that are now employ a ton of people who used to be on AFDC. So basically, AFDC is for single women who have like been abused or just in general actual like stressing social dynamics that aren't necessarily abusive, just like children in need, like actually like I think it's direct harm sort of to give women the options to keep going. All right. The conversation about welfare in the mid 1990s was about shaming certain families, saying welfare queens are driving pink Cadillacs to the liquor store to cash their welfare checks, or they are engaging in fraud to get many more checks than they should, or that they're having more children to get bigger checks. The purpose of all these kinds of statements that were widely repeated was to create an image of who was receiving AFDC. 60% of welfare recipients evoke urban black communities. One of the primary users of AFDC was women who were in abusive relationships or women who were getting divorced who were not in the labor force. And so the effort to create the image of the welfare queen that was really different from who was receiving it was an effort to force all sorts of caretakers who didn't have a ton of job skills into the labor force at low wage jobs. This was a really deliberate effort by business to cut wages so they could make more profit. Uh, so this 60% number, if you've read The Birth Earth, it's actually interesting. It says to pay attention to the number in the book a as a fertility drop number, and it's possible that this was a fear mongering of this 60% replacement in job form, and you couldn't really say they were replacing you in the country, and this is not the politics of replacement, but in terms of the 60% number that the birther talks about, and the 60% of welfare recipients and that were hmm oh yes, so mostly welfare was meant to connect to the white folk to balance out the fertility rate, but since this was a scare towards 60% of black women who were selling their checks, um, so you can see where the bias really was, because this is more or less an attack on poor people. So, one of the primary users of oh right, you talk in your book about gay marriage. You say more about how that connects to reproductive politics. In the book, I ask how it is that gay marriage came to be the gay reproductive politics issue. It wasn't at all obvious. In the 70s, the question was collective households, all kinds of wild possibilities for reproduction, borrowing sperm, lesbians sleeping with a man, or other kinds of do-it-yourself ways of getting pregnant. It was about how do we care for lovers who became ill or disabled. It was about a politics of love and households of refusing the heterosexual nuclear family and moving ever more widely into experiments and, well, that doesn't sound good. I can see why somebody would read that and be like, experimentation on society abroad, when these people have always existed. And so I just think it's not a good framing, honestly, and collective living and other alternatives to the nuclear family. Beginning in the 90s, and by the decade after 2010 for sure, it's all about gay marriage. What happened to the change in politics of queer communities from experimenting with forms of households to gay marriage? One of things that I'm tracking across this book, starting in the 1980s with Ronald Reagan, is how government and business politicians led to the privatization of care work and the privatization of wealth, which resulted in the upward distribution of wealth and the growing wealth gap. The privatization of care and wealth landed on gay folks in particularly harsh ways. Throughout the 70s and 80s, lesbian moms were losing their kids in custody fights, and gay dads were losing their right even to have visitation with their kids after the breakup of heterosexual marriage because of claims that gay people were dangerous to children and were sexual predators. And the only safe places were families created by law and marriage, and officially sanctioned private spaces. The Sharon Kowalski case, which is little remembered now, was incredibly important in queer communities, especially lesbian communities, throughout the 1980s. When Sharon Kowalski was horribly injured in a car accident and her lover, Karen Thompson, was not able to take care of her because when Sharon's parents found out they were lovers, they were disgusted and horrified and insisted that they were going to be the ones to have custody of Sharon and make decisions about her health care. For more than a decade, Karen Thompson was addressing gay pride parades and all sorts of rallies about the politics of caring for lovers and what everybody needed to know, what kinds of legal protections we would need to prevent this from happening in our own households. The AIDS crisis was the same, only for gay men mostly, where lovers weren't able to care for their partners or even have a say in where they got their care or where they were buried if birth families wanted to intervene. So, systematically, over the course of the last 40 years, the politics of family rights became more and more about the law and about the right to protect dependents or people who might become dependent. And as the social safety net evaporated, the only places you could count on getting care was in the privatized family. And so gay people were compelled by the privatization of care. So gay politics got pushed more and more inevitably toward crap, we have to fight for gay marriage. Wow. And then healthcare was obviously the other huge issue. If the only other way we got healthcare in this country is through our employers, well, you have twice as good a chance of getting healthcare if you can get healthcare from who you're sleeping with, which is to say, if you're married to who you're sleeping with, then you can get on their health plan. And so that too is one of the carrots that was held out for gay folks in choosing nuclear families and conjugal couples as the unit that we would fight for. How did reproductive politics contribute to the rise of Trump? To get there, I need to talk about the foreclosure crisis. The foreclosure crisis was really, really important in that it put millions of people out of their homes, but it didn't affect everybody equally, obviously. One of the causes of the foreclosure crisis, or the economic meltdown of 2007 to 2011 to 2012, was predatory loans by banks and the financial services industry that specifically targeted certain people. In fact, one former financial services industry employer told a reporter that subprime came to be a demographic category rather than just the name of a certain kind of loan, and that demographic category was disproportionately likely to be female, black, Latino, Latina, Latinx, and especially the people who were at the middle of that Venn diagram. Black and Latina heads of households, single moms. So these were the people who were overwhelmingly the most likely to fight to be targeted for a predatory or subprime loan that were written to be so confusing that nobody could understand them. This looked an awful lot like the narrative of welfare reform and who's targeted. And then, as these loans became more and more unpayable, the economy started to crash and the housing market hit a death spiral, where the more homes were foreclosed on, the more homes would be foreclosed on because people were losing jobs, because the economy was sinking and homes were becoming worth less and less, and nobody could sell their homes for what they had paid for them. So, this probably plays into the 60% that the birther talks about. But I'm pretty sure it's too soon for it to be 60% at the moment. But it does talk about the number being something we should focus on. In the middle of all that, Rick Santinelli, who was a commentator on CNBC, was standing in the Chicago commodity pit, and he launched into this rant against the Obama administration, which he claimed was going to help out these homeowners. The Obama administration was never going to help these homeowners. So, more or less, Obama was just there for a symbol of hope and difference because he was the first black president. So, he was sort of yanked into the neoliberal establishment, probably never had a chance to enact anything that was revolutionary. So it was honestly false hope. Oh, and so with the 60% that the birther talks about, which is related to and connected to the housing market crash because of people who aren't white who want to own homes. And so it is more or less a greedy take back against native people and probably immigration as well. All right. The Obama administration, yeah, they didn't do it, but he was like, these are the losers. Mortgages. This is America. People, do you want to pay for your neighbor's mortgages? He claimed that immoral people were gonna default on their loans so they could get cheaper loans what the Obama administration was going to give them. The rant launched the Tea Party. It was not very subtly racist. This was the time when the business press was going off on blacks and illegal immigrants being the holders of these mortgages and being stupid and irresponsible, unable to understand what these mortgages were, and then unable to pay them. The Rick Santinelli rant went viral on YouTube and was played on the evening news and on financial shows over and over again. It was called the rant that launched the Tea Party and became the nucleus of the coalition that elected Trump. So just like under Reagan and then Clinton, the claim was made that the economy was sinking as a result of this 1% of the budget, AFDC, obviously a scapegoat because of uh, the opportunity, the financial opportunity being absorbed by the rich in of itself. So many people could be born and live flourishing, but of course, it really makes no sense to try and risk having children when it's just going to be siphoned away from that family. So, anyways, these folks who were much more sinned against than sinning were held to be responsible for the financial collapse of the late 2000s, and they were put out of their homes in the horrendous number. And we also get out of that a right-wing formation of the Republican Party that was explicitly racist, explicitly organized to trash government. This was the wing of the party that was responsible for electing Trump. It sounds like you're saying is that white supremacy is behind the kind of privatization of caring labor because of fear that if you offer government benefits to women of color, it might take advantage of them. Absolutely. More than a century ago, Webb Du Bois wrote in Black Reconstruction that white supremacy was about being duped, about working class white folks agreeing to ally themselves with rich allies rather than with working class black folks and together resisting their collective impoverishment. This worked exactly like that. These were all narratives about the immorality of people of color, of households of color, and white people who benefited from these programs, who were certainly benefited from higher wages, were lulled into hating people of color, or agreeing to loathe the supposed immorality of people of color, and out of that, essentially, agreed to have government programs that help them stripped and have wages continue to go down. Middle class white people get persuaded to, essentially, vote against our own interests, starting with Reagan, because of his incredible ability to persuade us that it was only a primary black woman who were benefiting from government programs. Indeed, they will eat their own just to kill who they hate. Like, they will firebomb their own communities. I mean, it's happening now. There's just lead in food everywhere. There's deregulation now. So, I really don't think it matters that much because, oh, I mean, obviously, still fight for it, talk about it. It's just, it almost feels like it doesn't matter, you know? Alright. What motivates the architects of this economic system of neoliberalism? Is racism motivating them, or are they just using racism to increase their wealth? Is it greed that motivates them? The Republican coalition is complicated. There's the white nationalist right for sure, which in the current movement we associate the Breitbart and Richard Spencer and Steve Bannon. There's Wall Street, which doesn't care very much about either morality or racism. They didn't care if we're all in conjugal couples or not. They don't care about racism except so far as it increases profits. It was the particular marriage of the conservative religious right, the white nationalist right, and Wall Street that produced this configuration. So, the nationalist right was motivated by racism, Wall Street was motivated by greed, and the conservative right was motivated by sexual morality? Right. The desire to stick us all in nuclear families. So, yeah, you basically walk the line. You think you're being revolutionary by getting your way, when it's actually you're still being crucified. Again, like I said in the lyric, you're back to regular scheduled bullshit. You think there's change, but it's all identity politics that has been hijacked when you aren't actually getting your way at all. Okay, what do you hope to achieve by framing politics in terms of reproductive politics? How does this help you see things you otherwise might not see? Feminism have known forever that the public and the private are not opposite things, right? We know that's not why. The personal is politics was such a good feminist slogan. What happens in our households is political. And I'm just turning that formulation on its head and saying what happens in our public policy is living also in our households. Our households are the place where we live our economic situation. And so I want other people to be able to see that in order to be effective in opposing something that is really in nobody's interest except the 1%. Exactly. I think I went over that. I really do think the Angel Spit lyric really puts this together. What do you want your readers to take away from this book? I want people to be mad because they were stupid, or sorry, because they were duped. Because our lives don't want to be this hard. We can work fewer hours. We can have more time for our households if businesses' profits weren't so big. We can have more government programs if people weren't persuaded to hate feminists, hate queer folks, and hate people of color, in particular. Particularly, when it stacks, it really becomes a problem, and we know it stacks. When we see that, we can be more effective in building movements for human freedom. What do you want people to do? I want people to oppose neoliberalism in all its forms. I want people to oppose racism in all its forms. I want people to recognize that our households have been pushed into straitjackets of both form and time and be able to imagine something else. I want people to join a face-to-face organization with someone and figure out what resistance means in this moment and in this time and help us build a different kind of country and different kind of policies throughout the world. I want business to be defeated in its effort to give more and more wealth to the 1% and less to the majority of people. I want a different kind of United States and world where everybody has what they need and schools not scrambling for foreclosures, both K-12 and public universities. I want everybody to have access to safe neighborhood where their children weren't under threat of being killed by the police. I want people to have real reproductive justice. So, I really should have pulled up more things about this to sort of segue, but I think you get the point that foreclosure to even who's being shot by the police is a form of reproductive politics and state eugenics to some level. Alright, guys. I'll be back in the next one.